The odds were quite chilling, as the assault troops faced at least 7 times their number. In the darkness, erratic tides and currents pushed the small invasion fleet a mile off course. As the first boats approached the shore, they were met with significant fire from two 75mm guns. Surprisingly, the defenders valiantly manned some of the remaining batteries and sank several of these boats, inflicting hundreds of casualties. Boat after boat was blown out of the water. The barrage was so intense that many of the invaders leapt from their boats, and then they were dragged underwater by nearly 100 pounds of equipment on them. Less than a third of the assault force actually survived. They landed further east than anticipated, near North Point, and Colonel Gempachi Seto led the men west towards the Malinta Hill and south against a place called Monkey Point. At about midnight, a Marine messenger dashed into the tunnels, shouting, "600 Japs have just landed." For 3 hours, Wainwright remained in suspense until news arrived that a Marine anti-aircraft gun pit a mile from his tunnel had been captured. Moments later, a radiogram came in from FDR, praising the defenders as, quote, "living symbols of our war aims and the guarantee of victory," which,
I don't think
yeah.
any of these guys are going to be pretty impressed with that title.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like, okay, The Japanese pressed on towards the Malinta Tunnel's entrance under very heavy fire, fending off 3 consecutive counterattacks. Just before dawn, 500 untrained sailors, the last reserves, emerged from the tunnel and they crawled towards the fighting. Alongside the Marines of the HQ and service company, they launched an attack that completely caught the Japanese off guard, as they awaited aerial and tank support, forcing them to fall back on both flanks. Then at 10 a.m., the American defenders could hear the horrifying sound, rumble, that is, of tanks. In hindsight, it was a glaring oversight that MacArthur never deployed any tanks to Corregidor to assist in its defense. It's just, one last thing I guess you could say that MacArthur fucked up, but in my opinion, why would you have tanks on Corregidor when they'd be better used at Bataan? So I wouldn't actually blame him on this one.
If you just look at the terrain, it looks like there's elevation. So
Yeah,
tanks don't do well with elevated and narrow terrain. So
yeah.
kind of makes sense.
Your batteries and your guns are more than adequate for this kind of fight. I don't think tanks would have made the difference. Anti-tank weapons would have, because it's very, a concentrated area to fight, a lot of places to hide. Once Wainwright learned,
Anti-aircraft guns, not anti-tank guns.
yeah, true. Once Wainwright learned that armor was moving against his men and he had no anti-tank defenses, a nightmare flickered into his mind, and as he described it at the time, a tank nosing into the tunnel, spraying lead at the wounded and merces. So yeah, that's pretty horrifying if you have no ability to take out these tanks, other than, Molotov cocktails, which absolutely would work on the Japanese tank models. They had open shafts and stuff. Wainwright turned to his staff and he said, "We can't hold out much longer." He had lost an estimated 800 soldiers by that point, and he recognized that further resistance was futile. What Wainwright did not realize was that the Japanese had suffered a staggering 70% casualty rate during the landing of their 2,000 troops, and they were on their last legs. General Homa had depleted the last of his reserves. It was actually a pretty close battle. At about 10:15 a.m., he ordered Brigadier General Louis Beebe to broadcast a previously prepared surrender message. And in a choked voice, Wainwright instructed, "Tell the Japs that we'll cease firing at noon." To limit the surrender to the 4 islands in Manila Bay, he radioed Major General Sharp, transferring official command of the rest of the Philippines to him. Guns were spiked, codes were burned, and radio equipment was destroyed. Wainwright wrote his final message to FDR, and this is what it had to say. "With a broken heart and a head bowed in sadness, but not in shame, I report to Your Excellency that today I must arrange terms for the surrender of the fortified islands of Manila Bay. There is a limit of the human endurance, and that limit has long since been passed. Without a prospect of relief, I feel it is my duty to my country and to my gallant troops to end this useless effusion of blood and human sacrifice. If you agree, Mr. President, please say to the nation that my troops and I have accomplished all that is humanly possible, and that we have upheld the best traditions of the United States and its army. May God bless and preserve you and guide you and the nation in the effort to achieve ultimate victory. With profound regret and a continued pride in my gallant troops, I go to meet the Japanese commander. Goodbye, Mr. President. Yeah. So, Wainwright would later remark, it was the terror vested in a tank that was the decisive factor. I envisioned the devastation that even one of those could wreak if it nosed into the tunnel where our helpless wounded and their brave nurses lay. That was ultimately why he tossed in the towel, and everything is, of course, hindsight. If he had known the plight of the Japanese, I think he would have continued the fight, but of course, hindsight. For the fighting men, it was pretty traumatic. Colonel Howard of the 4th Marines broke down sobbing, and he had to say this at the time, "My God, and I had to be the first Marine officer ever to surrender a regiment. All American guns ceased firing. Wainwright waited about 2 hours, then he drove east in a Chevrolet with 5 staff members to Denver Hill. They proceeded on foot past the dead and the dying, and they were met near the top of the hill by a group of Japanese soldiers. A Japanese lieutenant stated that the surrender must encompass all American and Filipino troops in the entire Philippine archipelago. Wainwright responded, I do not choose to discuss surrender terms with you. Take me to your senior officer. Colonel Moto Nakayama, the same officer who accepted King's surrender of Bataan, stepped forward, and Wainwright informed him that he would surrender the 4 islands of Manila Bay. Nakayama replied angrily that he had explicit orders from General Homa to bring Wainwright to Bataan for the capitulation ceremony, only if he agreed to relinquish all troops. Now, at that moment, General Homa was unaware that Corregidor was prepared to surrender. A report that indicated about 31 boats had been sunk during the night, which is pretty horrifying if you're a general. Oh man, that's bad.
Well,
Resulting in
it's
the
70% of his
yeah,
post, right?
it's like holy shit. Can you imagine if that happened to Yamashita with Singapore? Because that was a very real. If it hadn't been for his clever little ploys, that was definitely could have happened. Anyways, resulting in the cancellation of the reinforcement wave, leaving about 21 landing crafts available. So yeah, he screwed up, to say the least. Those aware that disgrace awaited them, Homa was suddenly, buoyed by a staff officer bursting in with news that a white flag of truce had been flung over Corregidor. Homa was so relieved that he radioed Nakayama, instructing him to disregard previous orders and escort Wainwright to Bataan immediately. At about 4 p.m., Wainwright, leaning heavily on a cane at this point, appearing quite thin, set foot on Bataan soil at Cabacben. 2 cars transported him and his party to a small blue-painted house. The Americans waited on an open porch overlooking the southern expanse of Manila Bay, where Corregidor was still erupting in shell bursts. The battle had not yet ended, as the Japanese saw it. Wainwright and his colleagues were served cold water, and they were posed, for photographs taken by the Japanese newsmen, because of course the Japanese had, their propaganda tour over there. At 5 p.m., a Cadillac approached, carrying the barrel-chested General Homa, who looked crisp and vigorous in his olive drab uniform. He welcomed the Americans, remarking, You must be very tired and weary. Wainwright expressed his gratitude, and they sat together on a porch around a long table. Wainwright then presented a single note surrendering Corregidor, along with Forts Frank, Drum, and Hughes. Homa, who was proficient in English, he was, of course, someone who went overseas, wanted his staff to fully understand the proceedings, so he had an interpreter read the document aloud. With a stony expression, he stated that he could only accept the surrender of all troops in the Philippines. Wainwright then retorted, The troops in the Visayas and Mindanao areas are no longer under my command. They are commanded by General Sharp, who in turn is under General MacArthur's high command. Homa flushed, feeling as though he was being made a fool. He instructed the interpreter to inform Wainwright that the Japanese had intercepted messages from Washington affirming Wainwright's position as the commander-in-chief of all Philippine forces. Wainwright steadily insisted that he had no authority over General Sharp, however. General Homa lost his temper, slamming his fists on the table while facing his chief of staff, stating in Japanese, What should we do, Wachi? Major General Takaji Wachi suggested that he believed Wainwright was just lying to them. In response, General Homa declared, In that case, we cannot negotiate. Let us continue the battle. Regaining his composure, he said calmly to Wainwright, Since you are not in supreme command, I see no further necessity for my presence here. And as he was, doing that motion to prepare to leave, one of Wainwright's staff members, alarmed, shouted, "Wait!" The Americans quickly convened a conference. Pale faced, Wainwright turned to Homa and he said this: "In light of the fact that any further bloodshed in the Philippines is unnecessary and futile, I will assume command of all American forces in the Philippines, even at the risk of serious reprimand from my government following the war." Despite this, Homa was offended and skeptical of Wainwright's sincerity. He instructed the Americans to return to Corregidor and reconsider the matter. Homa then stated, "If you see fit to surrender, then do so to the commanding officer of the regiment on Corregidor. He will in turn bring you to me in Manila. I declare this meeting over